Back when TV dinners were still a novelty and fast food was a rare treat, grandmothers across America were masters of the kitchen, turning simple ingredients into meals that could feed a family of 8 without breaking the bank. These are the 25 forgotten dinners that once graced every American table, meals that have quietly slipped away from our modern kitchens, but never from our hearts. Salisbury steak with brown gravy. Long before anyone knew what molecular gastronomy was, grandmothers were transforming humble ground beef into something that looked and tasted like restaurant fare. Salisbury steak was their answer to making dinner feel special on a Tuesday night. Ground beef was mixed with breadcrumbs, egg, and seasonings, then shaped into oval patties that resembled real steaks. The real magic happened in the gravy, a rich, brown sauce made from pan drippings that could make cardboard taste good. This dish represented the American dream on a plate, taking something ordinary and making it extraordinary. The steaks were pan-fried until golden, then simmered in that gorgeous gravy, alongside mushrooms and onions. Served over mashed potatoes or egg noodles, it was comfort food that fooled nobody but satisfied everyone. Your grandmother understood that sometimes the best meals came from the heart, not the wallet. And Salisbury steak was proof that simple ingredients could create lasting memories. Porcupine meatballs. These weren't your ordinary meatballs. They were little spheres of ground beef and rice that got their name from the way the rice stuck out like quills after cooking. Your grandmother would mix ground beef with uncooked rice, onions, and seasonings, then roll them into balls and simmer them in a tomato-based sauce. As they cooked, the rice would absorb the flavors and stick out from the meatballs, creating their distinctive porcupine appearance. The genius of this dish was that it was a complete meal in one pot. The rice cooked right along with the meat, absorbing all the flavors of the sauce and the beef. The result was meatballs that were tender and flavorful, with a texture that was different from anything else on the table. Your grandmother would serve them over mashed potatoes or alongside vegetables, creating a hearty meal that was both familiar and exotic. These meatballs proved that sometimes the best dishes come from the most unexpected combinations. Pork chops and sauerkraut. When your grandmother wanted to create something that tasted like it came from the old country, she'd make pork chops and sauerkraut, a dish that was both hearty and flavorful. Thick-cut pork chops would be browned until golden, then nestled into a bed of sauerkraut that had been seasoned with caraway seeds and sometimes a touch of brown sugar to balance the tartness. The whole thing would be baked slowly until the meat was tender and the sauerkraut had absorbed all those wonderful flavors. This was comfort food with a German twist, a meal that could warm you up on the coldest winter nights. The sauerkraut would become sweet and mellow during the long cooking process, while the pork chops stayed juicy and flavorful. Your grandmother might add sliced apples or onions for extra sweetness, or serve it with mashed potatoes and rye bread. This dish proved that simple ingredients from different cultures could come together to create something uniquely American. Beef stroganoff. Nothing said fancy dinner quite like beef stroganoff, even though most grandmothers made it with budget-friendly ingredients. This Russian-inspired dish became an American classic because it combined the elegance of cream sauce with the practicality of stretching a small amount of beef into a full meal. Strips of beef were quickly seared, then simmered in a sauce made from beef broth, sour cream, and mushrooms, creating a dish that was both sophisticated and satisfying. The secret to great stroganoff wasn't expensive cuts of meat, it was the technique. Your grandmother knew how to make tough cuts tender through slow cooking and the right combination of flavors. She'd serve it over egg noodles or rice, letting the creamy sauce coat every strand. The dish taught an important lesson. Elegance doesn't require a big budget, just a little creativity and a lot of love. When company was coming, stroganoff made everyone feel special. JellO mold salads. The 1950s and 60s belonged to JellO, and your grandmother was the queen of the wiggly, colorful creations that graced every holiday table. These weren't just desserts. They were salads that could contain anything from shredded carrots and pineapple to cottage cheese and nuts. The lime green version with cottage cheese and pineapple was a particular favorite, offering a sweet and tangy combination that somehow made perfect sense at the time. Creating the perfect JellO mold was an art form that required patience and planning. Your grandmother would carefully layer different colored gelatins, suspend fruits and vegetables in perfect symmetry, and create stunning presentations that looked like edible rainbows. These dishes represented optimism and prosperity. The idea that food could be both nutritious and beautiful. While they might seem strange today, they were symbols of creativity and abundance that brought families together around the dinner table. Baked beans and franks. Saturday night meant baked beans and franks in your grandmother's house, a meal that was both simple and satisfying. She'd start with dried beans that had been soaking overnight, then cook them slowly with molasses, brown sugar, and a touch of mustard until they were tender and sweet. The frankfurters would be scored and nestled into the beans during the last part of cooking, letting them absorb all those wonderful flavors while adding their own smoky richness to the dish. This wasn't just a meal, it was a tradition that brought the whole family together for a casual Saturday evening. The beans would be thick and flavorful, with a sauce that was both sweet and tangy. Your grandmother might add a bit of bacon or salt pork for extra richness, or throw in some onions for depth. Served with brown bread or cornbread, it was a meal that was both filling and economical. Baked beans and franks represented the kind of cooking that turned simple ingredients into something special through patience and love. Ambrosia salad. This wasn't really a salad in the traditional sense. It was more like a bowl of heaven, combining fruits, nuts, and marshmallows in a sweet, creamy mixture that was the star of every potluck dinner. Your grandmother's version typically included oranges, pineapple, coconut, marshmallows, and sometimes grapes or cherries, all held together with whipped cream or mayonnaise. The result was something that was part dessert, part side dish, and entirely delicious. The name Ambrosia came from Greek mythology, where it was the food of the gods, and your grandmother's version certainly lived up to that reputation. The combination of textures, the juicy fruit, the chewy marshmallows, the crunchy nuts, created something that was exciting to eat. It was often served at holidays and special occasions, adding a touch of sweetness and celebration to the meal. Ambrosia salad represented abundance and joy, a dish that made everyone smile. Ham salad sandwiches. When the Sunday ham was too good to waste, your grandmother would transform the leftovers into something completely different but equally delicious. Ham salad was her answer to the question of what to do with that last bit of meat that was too small for a proper meal, but too good to throw away. She'd dice the ham finely, mix it with mayonnaise, a touch of mustard, and sometimes chopped pickles or celery for crunch. The resulting mixture was perfect for sandwiches, crackers, or even stuffing into tomatoes for a light lunch. The texture was smooth but not mushy, with little bursts of flavor from the seasonings. Your grandmother might add a hard-boiled egg or two for extra richness, or a sprinkle of paprika for color. Ham salad sandwiches were the kind of meal that made lunch feel special, proving that even leftovers could be transformed into something wonderful with a little creativity and care. Tomato soup and grilled cheese. The ultimate comfort food combination, tomato soup and grilled cheese, was your grandmother's answer to making lunch feel special. She'd start with a can of tomato soup, but then work her magic, adding a splash of cream, a pinch of sugar, and maybe some herbs to transform it into something that tasted homemade. The grilled cheese sandwiches were works of art, made with real butter and cheese that melted perfectly between slices of bread that were golden brown and crispy. The secret was in the technique. Your grandmother knew exactly how long to cook the sandwiches, so the bread was perfectly toasted and the cheese was completely melted. She'd cut them diagonally, creating perfect triangles for dipping into the creamy soup. This combination represented the kind of cooking that could turn the simplest ingredients into something magical, proving that sometimes the best meals were the most basic ones made with love and attention to detail. Chicken a la king. This elegant dish transformed leftover chicken into something worthy of royalty, proving that your grandmother could make magic happen with whatever was in the refrigerator. Chunks of chicken were swimming in a rich, creamy sauce, studded with peas, carrots, and sometimes mushrooms. The sauce, made from butter, flour, and cream, was seasoned with just the right amount of salt, pepper, and herbs to create something that tasted like it came from a fancy restaurant. Chicken a la king was typically served over toast points, biscuits, or puff pastry, making it feel like a special occasion meal even on ordinary weeknights. The dish represented resourcefulness at its finest. Nothing went to waste in your grandmother's kitchen, and even the humblest leftovers could be transformed into something spectacular. The creamy sauce could hide any imperfections in the chicken, and the presentation made everyone feel like they were dining at the finest establishment in town. Meatloaf with brown sugar glaze. Meatloaf was the ultimate comfort food, a dish that could turn ground beef into something special enough for Sunday dinner. Your grandmother's version was never dry or boring. It was moist, flavorful, and topped with a glaze that caramelized into something almost magical. The secret was in the mixture: ground beef combined with breadcrumbs, eggs, and seasonings, then shaped into a loaf that would slice beautifully. The brown sugar glaze was what made this meatloaf legendary. A combination of brown sugar, ketchup, and sometimes mustard would be brushed on top during the last part of baking, creating a sweet and tangy coating that complemented the savory meat perfectly. Served with mashed potatoes and green beans, this was a meal that defined American comfort food. Your grandmother understood that meatloaf wasn't just about feeding people. It was about creating a sense of home and belonging around the dinner table. Spam and pineapple skillet. During the years when meat was expensive or hard to find, your grandmother discovered that Spam could be transformed into something surprisingly delicious. She'd slice the Spam thick and brown it in a skillet until it was crispy on the outside. Then add chunks of pineapple that would caramelize in the same pan. The combination of the salty meat and sweet fruit created a flavor profile that was both unexpected and satisfying. This dish represented resourcefulness at its finest, taking an ingredient that many people looked down on and turning it into something that the whole family would ask for again and again. Your grandmother might add bell peppers or onions for color and crunch, or serve it over rice for a complete meal. The sweet and salty combination taught an important lesson about keeping an open mind and finding the potential in unexpected ingredients. Stuffed cabbage rolls. These little packages were like presents on a plate, each one carefully wrapped and filled with a mixture of ground beef, rice, and seasonings. Your grandmother would blanch whole cabbage leaves until they were pliable, then fill them with the meat mixture and roll them up like little burritos. They'd be arranged in a baking dish and covered with a tomato sauce, then baked until the cabbage was tender and the filling was hot and flavorful. The process of making stuffed cabbage rolls was labor-intensive, but the results were worth every minute. Each roll was a perfect individual serving, and the combination of the sweet cabbage, savory filling, and tangy sauce created something that was both familiar and exotic. Your grandmother might make dozens at a time, freezing some for later meals. These rolls represented the kind of cooking that took time and patience, but created memories that lasted a lifetime. Stuffed pork chops. When your grandmother wanted to make pork chops feel special, she'd create little pockets in thick-cut chops and fill them with a savory stuffing mixture. The stuffing was usually made from breadcrumbs, herbs, and sometimes sausage or apples, creating a contrast of flavors and textures that made each bite interesting. The chops would be browned first, then baked until the meat was tender and the stuffing was hot and flavorful. This technique transformed an ordinary pork chop into something that looked and tasted like it belonged in a fancy restaurant. The stuffing helped keep the meat moist during cooking, while adding flavor and visual appeal. Your grandmother might serve these with applesauce or gravy, letting the sweet or savory accompaniments complement the rich, satisfying meat. Stuffed pork chops represented the kind of cooking that took a little extra effort but created memories that lasted forever. Stuffed bell peppers. When your grandmother wanted to make vegetables the star of the show, she'd create these colorful cups filled with a hearty mixture of ground beef, rice, and seasonings. The bell peppers became edible bowls, their natural sweetness complementing the savory filling perfectly. Each pepper was carefully hollowed out, then stuffed with a mixture that often included onions, tomatoes, and sometimes cheese, creating a complete meal in a single serving. The beauty of stuffed peppers lay in their versatility and presentation. They could be made ahead of time and baked when needed, making them perfect for busy weeknights. Your grandmother might add different spices depending on her mood. Sometimes Italian herbs, sometimes a touch of paprika for warmth. The peppers would emerge from the oven tender and slightly charred, their vibrant colors making the dinner table look like a garden. This dish taught that vegetables could be exciting and satisfying, not just something to endure. Homemade beef stew. When the weather turned cold, your grandmother would pull out her biggest pot and create a beef stew that could warm you from the inside out. She'd start by browning chunks of beef until they were caramelized and full of flavor. Then add onions, carrots, potatoes, and whatever other vegetables she had on hand. The whole thing would simmer for hours, filling the house with the most incredible aromas. The secret to great beef stew was patience. Your grandmother understood that tough cuts of meat needed time to become tender, and that flavors needed time to meld together. She might add a bottle of beer or a splash of red wine for depth, or throw in some herbs from her garden. The result was a stew that was hearty and satisfying, perfect for serving over rice, or with crusty bread for sopping up every last bit of that rich, flavorful broth. Chicken and dumplings. On cold winter nights, nothing could warm a house quite like the smell of chicken and dumplings simmering on the stove. Your grandmother would start with a whole chicken, simmering it slowly until the meat fell off the bones and the broth was rich and golden. Then came the dumplings, fluffy clouds of dough that were dropped into the bubbling broth, where they'd puff up and absorb all those wonderful flavors. This dish was pure comfort in a bowl, the kind of meal that could cure whatever was wrong with your day. The chicken would be tender and flavorful, the broth rich and satisfying, and the dumplings light as air, but filling enough to keep you satisfied for hours. Your grandmother's version was never the same twice. Sometimes she'd add vegetables, sometimes herbs, but always love. It was a meal that brought the whole family to the table, gathering around steaming bowls on the coldest nights. Swedish meatballs. Long before IKEA made them famous, your grandmother was rolling perfect little meatballs that were tender, flavorful, and swimming in a rich, creamy sauce. These weren't just any meatballs. They were delicate spheres of ground beef and pork, seasoned with allspice and nutmeg, then simmered in a sauce made from beef broth and cream. The result was something that tasted like a hug from Sweden itself. The secret to perfect Swedish meatballs was in the technique. Your grandmother would mix the meat gently, roll each ball by hand, and brown them carefully before adding the sauce. She'd serve them over egg noodles or mashed potatoes, letting the creamy sauce coat everything on the plate. Often, she'd add a dollop of lingonberry jam on the side, providing a sweet tart contrast that made the meal complete. These meatballs taught that sometimes the best things come in small packages. Tuna noodle casserole. Every grandmother had her own version of this creamy, comforting dish that could stretch a single can of tuna into a meal for the whole family. The magic happened when egg noodles met cream of mushroom soup, creating a base that was both rich and economical. Frozen peas added little green bursts of freshness, while a topping of crushed potato chips or breadcrumbs provided the perfect golden crunch. This wasn't just dinner. It was a masterclass in making something from nothing. The beauty of tuna noodle casserole lay in its flexibility. Some grandmothers added sliced hard-boiled eggs for extra protein, while others snuck in diced celery for crunch. The dish could be assembled in the morning and baked when Dad got home from work, making it a working mother's best friend. When times were tough, this casserole proved that luxury wasn't about expensive ingredients. It was about the love that went into every spoonful. Liver and onions. This was the dish that separated the strong from the weak at your grandmother's dinner table. Liver and onions was not for the faint of heart, but those who appreciated it knew they were getting one of the most nutritious meals possible. Your grandmother would slice the liver thin, dredge it in flour, and pan-fry it quickly to keep it tender. The onions were cooked until they were sweet and caramelized, providing the perfect complement to the rich, mineral taste of the liver. The key to making liver palatable was not overcooking it. Your grandmother understood that liver should be cooked quickly and served immediately, before it had a chance to become tough and rubbery. She'd often serve it with mashed potatoes and gravy, letting the creamy potatoes balance the intensity of the liver. This dish taught important lessons about not wasting food and appreciating ingredients that might not be immediately appealing, but were incredibly good for you. Pot roast with vegetables. Sunday dinner meant pot roast, a meal that filled the house with the most incredible aromas and brought the whole family together. Your grandmother would start with a tough cut of beef, usually chuck roast, and transform it through slow cooking into something so tender it fell apart with a fork. The roast would be seared first to develop flavor, then braised with vegetables and seasonings until everything melted together into pure comfort. The vegetables were just as important as the meat. Carrots, potatoes, and onions that cooked alongside the roast, absorbing all those wonderful flavors. Your grandmother might add celery, parsnips, or turnips depending on what was in season. The result was a one-pot meal that was both elegant and homey, perfect for feeding a crowd or creating leftovers for the week. Pot roast represented the best of American cooking. Simple ingredients transformed through patience and love into something extraordinary. Creamed chipped beef on toast. This dish had many names, some more polite than others, but it was a staple in households across America. Dried beef was rehydrated and cooked in a rich white sauce, then served over toast for a meal that was both filling and economical. Your grandmother would make the white sauce from scratch, using butter, flour, and milk to create something smooth and creamy that could turn the saltiest dried beef into a satisfying meal. The key to great creamed chipped beef was balancing the saltiness of the meat with the richness of the sauce. Your grandmother might add a pinch of pepper or a dash of Worcestershire sauce for complexity. Served over buttered toast, it was a meal that could be made quickly but tasted like it took all day. This dish represented resourcefulness and the ability to make something delicious from the most basic ingredients. Macaroni and cheese casserole. This wasn't the boxed version that came later. This was the real deal, made from scratch with love and lots of cheese. Your grandmother would cook macaroni until it was just tender, then layer it with a cheese sauce made from butter, flour, milk, and real cheese. The whole thing would be topped with breadcrumbs and baked until golden and bubbly, creating a dish that was both creamy and crispy. The secret to perfect baked macaroni and cheese was using multiple types of cheese, usually cheddar for sharpness, and maybe some cream cheese for richness. Your grandmother might add a beaten egg to help bind everything together, or a touch of mustard for complexity. The result was a casserole that was far more sophisticated than its simple ingredients suggested, a dish that could serve as a side or a main course depending on the occasion. Chicken pot pie. When your grandmother wanted to create something that felt like a warm hug, she'd make chicken pot pie, a dish that combined tender chicken, vegetables, and a rich sauce all wrapped up in flaky pastry. The filling was usually made from leftover chicken or a whole chicken that had been poached until tender, then combined with carrots, peas, onions, and sometimes potatoes in a creamy sauce seasoned with herbs like thyme and sage. The pastry was often made from scratch, rolled out and carefully fitted over the filling to create a golden crown that would puff up beautifully in the oven. When you cut into it, steam would escape carrying all those wonderful aromas, and the flaky crust would give way to the creamy, satisfying filling underneath. This was comfort food at its finest, a meal that could cure homesickness and make any day feel special. Shepherd's pie. This wasn't just a casserole. It was a masterpiece of layering that created a complete meal in a single dish. Your grandmother would start with a layer of seasoned ground meat, usually beef, despite the name. Then add vegetables like corn, peas, and carrots. The whole thing would be topped with a thick layer of mashed potatoes that would brown beautifully in the oven, creating a golden crown over the savory filling below. The beauty of shepherd's pie was in its simplicity and completeness. Every food group was represented, and the combination of textures, the creamy potatoes, the savory meat, the tender vegetables, created something that was satisfying on every level. Your grandmother might add Worcestershire sauce to the meat for extra flavor, or mix cheese into the potatoes for richness. This was a dish that could feed a crowd and still have leftovers for tomorrow's lunch. Beef and noodles. This simple but satisfying dish was the ultimate comfort food, combining tender beef with egg noodles in a rich, flavorful broth. Your grandmother would start with a tough cut of beef, simmering it slowly until it fell apart into tender shreds. Then, she'd add homemade egg noodles, wide, flat ribbons that would cook in the same pot, absorbing all those wonderful flavors. The result was something that was more than the sum of its parts, a dish that was both soup and main course, both simple and sophisticated. The beef would be so tender, it could be cut with a fork, and the noodles would be perfectly chewy and flavorful. Your grandmother might add vegetables like carrots or celery for color and nutrition, but the star was always the combination of meat and noodles swimming in that rich, satisfying broth. Scalloped potatoes, layer upon layer of thinly sliced potatoes, swimming in a rich, creamy sauce. This was your grandmother's answer to making potatoes feel like a special occasion. She'd slice the potatoes paper thin, then layer them in a buttered baking dish with a sauce made from butter, flour, and milk. The whole thing would be baked slowly until the potatoes were tender and the top was golden brown. The secret to perfect scalloped potatoes was in the sauce. It needed to be thick enough to coat the potatoes, but not so thick that it became gluey. Your grandmother might add cheese for richness, or herbs like thyme for complexity. The result was a dish that was both elegant and comforting, perfect for serving alongside a roast or as a main course with a simple salad. Scalloped potatoes proved that sometimes the humblest ingredients could create the most sophisticated results. Cornbread dressing. This wasn't just stuffing. It was a dish that could stand on its own as the star of any meal. Your grandmother would start with homemade cornbread, then crumble it and mix it with herbs, vegetables, and broth to create something that was both familiar and special. The dressing would be baked until the top was golden and slightly crispy, while the inside remained moist and flavorful. The beauty of cornbread dressing was in its versatility. It could be made with different herbs and vegetables depending on the season, and it paired well with everything from roasted chicken to pork chops. Your grandmother might add sage and onions for a traditional flavor, or throw in some nuts and dried fruit for something more festive. This dish represented the kind of cooking that brought families together, creating traditions that were passed down through generations. Fried chicken with milk gravy. Nothing could make Sunday feel more special than the sound of chicken frying in your grandmother's cast iron skillet. She'd start with a whole chicken, cut into pieces and soaked in buttermilk to tenderize the meat. Each piece would be dredged in seasoned flour, then fried until the coating was golden brown and crispy, while the meat stayed juicy and tender inside. The smell alone could bring the whole neighborhood to her kitchen door. But the real magic happened after the chicken was done. Your grandmother would pour off most of the oil, leaving just enough to make gravy with the crispy bits stuck to the bottom of the pan. She'd add flour and milk, stirring constantly until the gravy was smooth and creamy, seasoned with salt, pepper, and sometimes a touch of sage. Served with mashed potatoes, biscuits, and green beans, this was a meal that defined Southern comfort food and created memories that lasted a lifetime. Hamburger gravy over mashed potatoes. When the paycheck ran thin and the cupboard looked bare, this dish saved countless families from going hungry. Grandma would brown a pound of ground beef in her trusty skillet, letting the fat render out to create the base for a rich, creamy gravy. She'd sprinkle in flour, whisking it into the beef drippings until it formed a golden paste. Then came the magic. Milk poured slowly while she stirred, creating a gravy that could feed 6 people with just 1 pound of meat. The secret was in the seasoning. Salt, pepper, and a dash of garlic powder transformed simple ingredients into comfort food that stuck to your ribs. Ladled over a mountain of mashed potatoes, this meal could silence even the hungriest teenager. The gravy would seep into every crevice of the potatoes, creating a harmony of flavors that made even the toughest times bearable. It was filling, affordable, and most importantly, it made everyone feel loved. Chipwreck casserole. The name might sound strange, but this casserole was anything but a wreck. Created during times when every ingredient mattered, it combined ground beef, noodles, and crushed potato chips into a dish that was both economical and satisfying. The potato chips weren't just a garnish. They were an essential ingredient that added crunch and flavor to every bite. Ground beef formed the protein base, seasoned simply with salt and pepper. Egg noodles provided substance and helped stretch the meat to feed more people. But the real genius was in the topping. Crushed potato chips mixed with a bit of butter and baked until golden. This created a textural contrast that made each forkful interesting. The casserole was assembled in layers, with the beef mixture on the bottom and the chip topping creating a crispy crown. It was the kind of dish that made children excited about dinner, even on the toughest days. Old school goulash, American chop suey. Before fancy pasta dishes took over American tables, goulash was the king of one-pot meals. This wasn't the Hungarian version your cookbook might describe. This was pure American ingenuity, born from necessity. Ground beef, elbow macaroni, and canned tomatoes came together in a dance of simplicity that could feed a family of 8 for under $2. The beauty of goulash lay in its flexibility. If you had an onion, you diced it and threw it in. A bell pepper from the garden? Perfect. Leftover corn from last night's dinner? Into the pot it went. The ground beef provided protein, while the pasta filled empty bellies. Tomatoes, whether fresh from the garden or canned from the store, gave it that tangy sweetness that made kids ask for seconds. It was the kind of meal that improved with age, tasting even better the next day when the flavors had time to meld together.